Hi, welcome back to our next session on the Apostle Paul. We're looking at this Bible study from Paul's letters and his experiences recorded in the book of Acts. I'm Guy Williams, pastor at First United Methodist Church in Dayton, Texas. Our mission is to lead people into a growing relationship with Jesus. And I'm hopeful that this Bible study will help you to grow in your relationship with Jesus. Today, we're going to be talking about Paul's co-workers. We're going to take a little break from Paul and his journeys to talk about Paul's co-workers because they are significant figures and they also have backstories, and their relationship with Paul and their own backstories are really great place for us to learn and to reflect on our own walk with Christ and our own journey of faith as well. So let's take a look. I'm going to talk about several, and you can download the reflection guide that's in this Facebook post or YouTube description, and it'll summarize things for you there and has some good questions to pause and to think about for yourself in light of each of these persons. So let's start out with Barnabas. Barnabas we meet in Acts chapter 4. His first name is Joseph. He is a Levite from Cyprus. He gains the nickname Barnabas, which means son of encouragement. And as we read about him and his adventures with Paul, we can kind of see why. Barnabas is someone who initially recruited Paul when he was referred to as Saul more frequently. At the end of chapter 11, he recruited Saul to come down with him and to work in Antioch. After Paul had his conversion experience on the Damascus Road, there's sort of a blank of about 13, 14 years where we don't have a narrative in Luke's gospel. He refers to this in the letter to the Galatians, Paul does, but there's nothing really narrating what happened except for a couple of brief mentions in Galatians that Paul writes. But where we do find Paul begin again and then take up the bulk of Acts from that point until the end is in the end of chapter 11 when Barnabas goes up to find Saul in Tarsus. He brings him back down to Antioch with him, and he begins to be a part of the teaching and evangelistic ministry in that church. So Barnabas is responsible for getting Paul kind of into the ministry and the mission that Luke is talking about in the book of Acts. Secondly, Barnabas is someone who helps Mark, John Mark, who we'll look at in a moment. He helps him remain in ministry and get back into ministry. There's a disagreement that came up between Paul and Barnabas at the end of Acts chapter 15. Paul was ready to go back and visit some of the churches they had been to and founded previously. Barnabas wanted to take Mark with them. Paul objected to this. Mark had apparently abandoned them during part of their previous journey, and Barnabas wanted to give him another shot. Now, Barnabas and Mark are either cousins or it's an uncle and nephew relationship. So Barnabas sticks up for his cousin or his nephew and wants to see him have a second chance. And as it turns out, Paul insists that it can't be so. They have a sharp disagreement, they have a falling out, and they part ways. Paul takes Silas, who we'll look at in a few minutes. But Barnabas takes Mark and they go on their own journey. Barnabas is the characteristics we really know him for are one, as being very generous. He sells a piece of land in order to support the church's mission, and he is an encourager who at least is responsible for recruiting Paul into the ministry that they were doing and to giving a second chance to Mark. So let's go ahead and look at John Mark. John Mark, his first name is John. He's also referred to as Mark, or he's simply called John Mark. When Peter escaped prison, they fled to Mark's mother's house, Mary's house, and that's where Peter stayed, rather. Mark is mainly known from these handful of passages in Acts, but also he's referred to in some of the letters of Paul that are later, like Colossians and 2 Timothy, later letters of Paul. So it does seem that there was a reconciliation of some sort. But also we know Mark as being the person who is responsible for the gospel according to Mark. He was a known associate of Peter's. And he journeyed with Paul at various points. Mark's is generally regarded as the earliest of the Gospels, somewhere between the year 60 and 65. And that is his kind of claim to fame. So it would seem that Mark, after having a second chance by Barnabas, really made good on that. Number one, to have gone on to author one of the Gospels. Number two, to have apparently reconciled with Paul at a later time, so that he is mentioned with appreciation in a couple of the later letters of Paul. So let's move on and talk about the next person, Silas. Silas is the person who was chosen by Paul to fill in and to be his traveling companion on the second missionary journey when he and Barnabas had a falling out. Silas was also referred to as Silvanus. That is, the variants in the name are kind of like Saul and Paul, apparently. One is a Greek version, one is a Hebrew version or a Jewish version of the name, and so, or Aramaic version of the name, I should say. So you might see both, and in some translations, like the New International, the NIV, in places in Paul's letters where Paul writes Silvanus, but he's referring, we understand, to Silas, they will translate it Silas for ease of reading for the reader, and then have a footnote to let you know what the Greek actually says there. But Silas is someone who we meet in Acts chapter 15 at the Jerusalem Council. They made a big decision. James, Peter, Paul, Barnabas, the leaders of the Jerusalem church, led by James, the brother of Jesus, made this big decision about the inclusion of the Gentiles without having to enter into the Jewish covenant of circumcision, but being able to enter into God's people and to the church simply through profession of faith and belief in Christ, the covenant that comes at baptism. So this is really big news, and there are some things that they're expected to obey around sexual morality and around food that's sacrificed to idols. And so they write the letter in chapter 15, and they're going to send it out to the churches. And Silas is one of the people who is selected to carry it because he is someone who is regarded well as one of the leaders in the Jerusalem church, and he's regarded as credible and trustworthy, so that when he delivers the letter, the people who hear it and who read it will know that if Silas is delivering it, then it is true to its origin, it is trustworthy, it's worth taking seriously. So Silas is really a great example. In chapter 16, 17, we read about Silas and his adventures with Paul. Silas was the one who was in the prison with Paul when the earthquake shook and the doors flew open, and they testified and witnessed to the Philippian jailer and brought he and his family to believe in Christ. But Silas is really known for being somebody who is credible, who is trustworthy, and who is thought well of in the church, so that his word was regarded highly. Next, let's look at Timothy. Timothy is someone we meet in Acts chapter 16 in the narration of Luke there, and he is a young person. He joins into the missionary journeys with, at that point, Paul and Silas. And we also know him from 2 letters that are written to him, and a couple of letters that are addressed to churches, but have his name included at the very beginning as part of the greeting. And so some scholars speculate if he could be considered a co-author at some level. But Paul meets Timothy. His mother is Jewish, and Luke tells us that his father is Greek. And Timothy is uncircumcised when they meet him, even though his mother is Jewish. And later we realize in 2 Timothy, his grandmother is also, along with his mother, are Christian believers. They're believers in Jesus who are Jewish. He is uncircumcised, so that probably means that his father is an unbelieving Greek Gentile. Now, he is well regarded and thought very highly of in the church in his region. And so Paul wanted to take him with him, and so he does. They take him on the journey. Paul really sees Timothy as very close to him, and it's very much a mentor-mentee type of relationship. Paul calls him later his true son in the faith, and so you can see it's a very close kind of relationship. He is pictured alongside Paul not only in the book of Acts, but also in a number of letters to the Thessalonians, to the Corinthians, the Colossians, Philippians, Romans, many of the great letters. And those letters also span some period of time. Thessalonians and Corinthians are written a little bit earlier, probably in the second journey or maybe the third missionary journey that Paul makes. But Colossians and Philippians are written from prison at a later date, and Romans is a little bit later than that too. So he's mentioned across a variety of communication across a span of time that Paul makes. And again, he has two personal letters from Paul encouraging him in his work in his own church. He begins ministry as a young adult, answers the call early, and is probably the closest companion of Paul over the period of years. Let's move next to Luke. Luke is referred to as a doctor by Paul in Colossians 4, verse 14, kind of in some closing comments there. He is mentioned as a co-worker in several of Paul's letters, and we also know him, obviously, as the author of the Gospel according to Luke and the Acts of the Apostles. Scholars commonly refer to these two works together as Luke Acts with a hyphen in between, because they can be seen as one unified two-part work. And that's not difficult to see if you read the first, say, 4 verses of the Gospel of Luke and then the first 2 or 3 verses of the Acts of the Apostles. It's really clear the continuity between the two. It's the same kind of voice. He gives a preface in Acts that says, you read in the first in my first volume about Jesus, and here's what happened next. Essentially, he's writing to and addressing it to the same person, Theophilus, which could be an individual whose name is Theophilus, but it also could be like a pseudonym for a general reader, either a general believer or the community of believers. And the reason that we think that is because the name Theophilus means lover of God. Theos is God. That's the first part. And philos is lover, or one who loves. And so kind of like we know Philadelphia means the city of brotherly love. Well, that's kind of what we're coming at, that Phil. So Theophilus means lover of God, and so it could be simply a name that just speaks to someone in general who's a Christian believer. In any event, there's a particular thing in Luke's narration in the book of Acts where we see that him side by side with Paul, not only mentioned in Paul's letters, but because the way he narrates the book changes. In most of the book of Acts, he is narrating it in the third person, like an author would who was not present for the events that were happening. However, in towards the second half of the book of Acts, he begins to narrate it in the third person plural. And so you have several passages where he switches in the narration. He starts to use the word we, which tells us that he was part of that journey. It begins in Acts chapter 16, and it's also found in some various sections of chapter 20, chapter 21, chapter 27, and chapter 28. I'll let you look those up, but it is kind of interesting just as a reader to see that Luke is here a part of the story. And so it's firsthand information, not just stuff that he has researched, although that's one of the things that we appreciate about Luke, is that he is kind of a scholar and a writer. Obviously, he wrote a whole gospel and the Acts of the Apostles. As a matter of fact, between Luke and Paul, I believe 2/3 of the New Testament are written by those two people because of the length of Luke and Acts and the volume of Paul's correspondence with his various churches and a few people, individuals. So Luke is a scholar and a writer. We see that in the very kind of introduction to Luke's gospel, that he's been very careful to investigate and to compile and to assemble this story so that he can strengthen Theophilus's faith and understanding. And then the other thing is being a missionary companion of Paul. All right, so let's get down to the last one that I'll look at in this session. There are others that we could get into, but I'm going to look at just one more, and that is the husband and wife duo of Priscilla and Aquila. Priscilla and Aquila are a married couple. They are tent makers. Paul meets them in Corinth in Acts chapter 18, at the very beginning of chapter 18. And he stays with them while he is in Corinth. They allowed him to stay with them. It seems that they allowed him to set up shop and work there and support himself by working as a part of their shop. I imagine them getting along quite well as believers, but also as people who grew up with the same profession. So just like when you meet somebody who's in the same business as you are, it's easy to find a lot of common ground. So I imagine that was the case. They are supportive of him. They're able to provide him a place to stay, which tells us that they have some means, some wealth, and they're generous. They're happy to put it to use for the service of the church and of the mission of Jesus. Their ministry is really one of collaboration, and in this sense, they're a great example. The husband is Aquila, the wife is Priscilla, but in most of the instances, not all, but the majority of the times that they are mentioned in the New Testament, she is mentioned first. Priscilla is mentioned when they say Priscilla and Aquila, and they're just about always mentioned together. Their legacy is really one of team leadership and of generosity, but also as teachers and mentors. Apollos is a companion of Paul, and we could have mentioned him. He shows up both in Acts briefly here in chapter 18, but also in the letters to the Corinthians and maybe a few other places in the kind of brief mentions at the end of letters for who to give thanks to and who to say hello to when you see them next. But Apollos is a believer who is highly intelligent, who is really on fire for the gospel, on fire for Jesus. And Priscilla and Aquila meet him, and they take him under their wing. They tutor him. They help him to grow. They're teachers and mentors for him to help sharpen him up and set him loose to have a really great teaching and evangelistic ministry. So their legacy also has to do with being teachers and mentors as well. All right, that wraps up this kind of quick look at Paul's co-workers. Again, I really do want you to download the reflection guide and take a look. Each of these people leave their own legacy and have their own really key characteristics that we find in both the book of Acts and sometimes in Paul's letters. And it's worth stopping and reflecting on what those are and how we've seen people with those characteristics work in our life through Christ's influence and God using them in our life, and what they call forth in us. So I'd really encourage you to do that. Thank you, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time.